Hey squad, welcome to another video selected by my patrons who apparently enjoy watching me suffer. Today, I'm going to look at some of the different ways that Middle-earth's history is given an invented history of its own. I'll look at how this affects our understanding of the narrative in ways Tolkien may have intended and in ways he might not have foreseen. And finally, at the behest of my audience, I will attempt to pressure test this narrative flexibility by making the strongest argument I can that the atrocities committed by the Noldor during their departure from Valinor have been greatly exaggerated. In supporting the intentionally absurd claim that Feanor is the victim of a millennia-long smear campaign, I will hopefully get us closer to an understanding of the line between artistic license and questionable adaptive practice. Even people who haven't read Tolkien know of how much detail he lavished on world-building. It's one of Middle-earth's standout features. Less widely known is that Tolkien went a step further by including metafictional elements that provide made-up explanations for how the lore itself was compiled, translated, and edited. Between the prologue and the first chapter of Lord of the Rings, he includes a note on the Shire records, an explanation of how the Red Book of Westmarch, written by Bilbo, Frodo, and Sam, was copied, expanded, and preserved over the generations. Tolkien casts himself as the translator and editor of this fictional book rather than as an author. In this guise, he explains some of his editorial choices, such as the decision to translate the actual Westron names on the grounds that, to present all the names in their original forms would obscure an essential feature of the times as perceived by the hobbits, whose point of view I was mainly concerned to preserve. The composition of the Red Book, and the interests and sources of its fictional authors, even become a feature in the story itself. In the final chapter of The Lord of the Rings, we read about Frodo handing the Red Book over to Sam to finish, thus understanding that the very chapter we are reading, telling of Frodo's departure, is meant to be understood as Sam's account of that event. This makes for a nice, heart-wrenching moment of realization, but it also suggests, however subtly, that attention ought to be paid to the presumed identity, or more accurately, identities, of the narrators. This even becomes a minor plot point in the revised edition of The Hobbit, where Tolkien takes the extra step of providing an in-universe justification for the changes made to Chapter 5. The true story of the ending of the Riddle game, as it was eventually revealed under pressure by Bilbo to Gandalf, is now given according to the Red Book, in place of the version Bilbo first gave to his friends and actually set down in his diary. This departure from truth, on the part of a most honest hobbit, was a portent of great significance. But the conceit of the Red Book of Westmarch and its translation is hardly the first or the only time Tolkien calls attention to narrative voice in his work. His earliest accounts of Middle-earth were presented as the Book of Lost Tales, in which a traveler from 5th century England called Ariel actually sails to Tol Eressëa and learns of the events of what we'd now call the First Age. Between the telling of the different tales, the other characters he meets debate which tale to relate, who is best to tell it, and even the proper historical form of the characters' names. Later on, Tolkien attempted a time travel novel about the fall of Númenor titled The Lost Road, opening on a pair of modern characters who travel to the past in their dreams, awakening with fragmentary memories. The narrator of The Hobbit, later presumed to be Bilbo, frequently addresses the reader directly, comments on the protagonist's failings, and makes reference to future events. After the publication of The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien made various efforts to reframe his mythology along similar pseudo-historical lines. He attributed the histories of different periods more specifically to different elven historians, and went back and forth on how far removed from these sources the actual Silmarillion should be. At one point he wrote, "What we have in the Silmarillion, etc., are traditions handed on by men in Númenor, and later in Middle-earth, Arnor and Gondor, but already far back from the first association of the Dúnedain and Elfriends with the Eldar in Beleriand, blended and confused with their own mannish myths and cosmic ideas." All these layered and nested narrators and sources quickly got very confusing, and in compiling the Silmarillion, Christopher decided, probably wisely, to cut almost every mention of the supposed authors or narrators of this work, selecting and arranging in such a way as seemed to me to produce the most coherent and internally self-consistent narrative. Unfortunately, this does obscure just how much energy Tolkien spent thinking up imaginary histories for his imaginary history. It was never an afterthought, but rather an element present in one form or another at every stage of his work. Tolkien is likely the reason these techniques became common in modern fantasy, but he was hardly the first person to use them. Different forms of frame narrative can be found in everything from the Canterbury Tales to Frankenstein. So when Tolkien put pseudo-historical frame narratives into his fiction, he was consciously applying an established literary technique to his own artistic goals. But the effects were perhaps more significant than he could have imagined. One of Tolkien's reasons may have been to support secondary belief, particularly in The Lord of the Rings. This isn't to say that Tolkien thought every successful work of fiction had to justify itself as plausible in the primary world, far from it. But for Tolkien himself, historically minded and cursed as he was with an acute sensitivity to language, a world in which characters named in Sindarin, Old Norse, and Old English were all milling about together and using the Gregorian calendar could only make sense if they were being presented in translation. Tolkien also used these devices when he needed to make retroactive changes to his stories. As I mentioned, he even managed to change a whole chapter in The Hobbit without breaking the illusion. If he had abused this by waving away any inconsistency as simple scribal error, the trick would have become tiresome. But instead, it became an additional avenue of creativity for him, as he imagined what events and circumstances might have led to seeming contradictions. His elaborate explanation of how Glorfindel of Gondolin, who was slain by a Balrog, came to be dwelling in Rivendell at the end of the Third Age, is my favorite example of this. Another more meaningful aim for Tolkien was achieving a sense of remoteness in time. This remoteness was one of the reasons he reacted so strongly to the real-world legends he drew inspiration from. It provided him a sense of awe and fired his curiosity, and he wanted to reproduce this experience for his readers. Just as Tolkien found it inspiring to explore possible solutions to the gaps in the actual literary and historical records of the distant past, at one point he expressed hope that by leaving similar gaps, he would inspire others. I would draw some of the great tales in fullness, and leave many only placed in the scheme and sketch. The cycles should be linked to a majestic whole, and yet leave scope for other hands wielding paint and music and drama. This was sufficiently important to him that he even worried at times that by publishing the Silmarillion, he would risk losing that remoteness. Fortunately, this has not been the case. Don Walls-Thumma identifies narrative uncertainty as one of the major reasons for this in a well-researched article on Tolkien's use of narrative uncertainty and how it affects fan engagement. Although Tolkien certainly never acknowledged it, and perhaps never even considered it, his use of pseudo-historical presentation, and particularly historical bias, creates precisely those new unattainable vistas that he despaired of destroying with the publication of the Silmarillion materials. Another unintended but fortunate effect was the melding of primary and secondary belief due to the nearly ruinous lack of order in which he left his writings upon his passing. I've already mentioned the problems this caused for his editors, but there were unexpected benefits as well. The inconsistent presentation of the Silmarillion, for example, can be attributed to in-universe causes. My father came to conceive the Silmarillion as a compilation, made long afterwards from sources of great diversity that had survived in age-long tradition. And this conception has indeed its parallel in the actual history of the book. To this may be ascribed the varying speed of the narrative, and also some differences of tone and portrayal, some obscurities, and here and there some lack of cohesion. Anyone delving into the seething mass of incongruity to be found in the posthumously published history of Middle-earth can choose to further prolong the game of conscious secondary belief with similar rationales. Among fans of the fictional detective Sherlock Holmes, practices like this are referred to as the Great Game, and some of Tolkien's contemporaries, like Dorothy Sayers, were already taking part in it during his lifetime. By inviting, and even at times directing, his readers to conceive of Middle-earth as an object of secondary belief apart from its author, Tolkien provided a tremendous degree of in-universe flexibility. And this helps explain why Tolkien continues to inspire such passionate dedication a half-century after his death. But as much as Tolkien may have intended to provoke this kind of response, I don't think he could have even conceived of the amount and diversity of collaborative subcreation that continues to this day. Everything from the reconstruction and expansion of his languages, to scholarship that is no less rigorous for being fictional, to the invention of gap-filler stories for gaming and television adaptations, to a whole gamut of unlicensed fanworks. We have certainly passed well beyond paint and music and drama. A lot of people like playing in the Middle-earth sandbox, and in a lot of ways, and inevitably, at times, debate arises over whether a given adaptation, whether officially sanctioned or not, is Tolkienian. To further explore this, at the prompting of my loyal audience, I'm going to use the narrative uncertainty Tolkien himself introduced to reinterpret the events of his writing in a way he certainly would not have intended. I'm going to justify the kinslaying at Alqualondë. Lest anyone think that I'm interested more in destruction than deconstruction, or fear that Tolkien would be appalled at this practice, allow me to offer a citation from The Lost Road in my defense. Rules may be strict, yet they are the means, not the ends of government. There are exceptions, for there is that which governs and is above the rules. Behold, it is by the chinks in the wall that light comes through, whereby men become aware of the light, and therein perceive the wall and how it stands. The veil is woven, and each thread goes in appointed course, tracing a design. Yet the tissue is not impenetrable, or the design would not be guessed. And if the design were not guessed, the veil would not be perceived, and all would dwell in darkness. Admittedly, this passage is regarding the possibility of time travel being an exception to the laws of the universe, but if he would not balk at a critique of physics itself, surely Tolkien would not balk at the relatively inconsequential matter of entertaining alternative interpretations of his fictional history, especially since he seems to have intentionally left the door open to such an approach. Most importantly, my object here is the same: to shine light through the chinks in the narrative wall to let us better perceive the story itself, as well as that which lies beyond it. The Alqualondë incident can be summarized as follows. In the wake of the death of the trees, the murder of Finwë, and the rape of the Silmarils, Fëanor and most of the rest of the Noldor decide to leave Valinor, in defiance of the Valar's wishes that they remain. Fëanor asks Olwë, the king of the Teleri, if the Noldor may travel on the Teleri's ships, and Olwë declines. Fëanor and his people attempt to board the ships anyway, violence ensues and escalates into a battle, and eventually the Noldor overcome the Teleri and depart with their fleet. According to the comments of the characters themselves and the observations of the narrators, this is the big event that determines that the Fëanorians are to be considered evil. The followers of Fingolfin are semi-evil, and the followers of Finarfin are only evil by association. Crucial to this interpretation are four main tenets: the perceived personalities and motivations of Fëanor and his siblings, the illegitimacy of the Noldor's desire to leave Valinor, the innocence and moral justification of Olwë and his people, and the Valar's presumed lack of intervention. Allowing for the sake of argument that the version we find in the Silmarillion is indeed meant to correspond closely with the original Elven accounts, we still have good reason to believe that said Elven historians would be biased in favor of these four assumptions. One important author, Rúmil of Valinor, seems to have been one of the Noldor who did not choose to leave Amon, and so presumably he disagreed with the perspective of those who did. The other author, Pengolodh of Gondolin, seems to have followed Turgon, and Turgon was notoriously steadfast in his hatred for the Fëanorian faction after the death of his wife. Both historians also have limited knowledge. Rúmil never went to Middle-earth at all, and Pengolodh would have spent a lot of time in Gondolin, the famously hidden city where accurate and up-to-date information about the rest of Beleriand would have been difficult to come by. After the fall of Gondolin, to fill the gaps in his knowledge, he relied on the reports of the refugees from Doriath, another sheltered realm where anti-Noldoran sentiment was strong. But just because a source has reasons to be biased doesn't mean that it's wrong. So let's examine the evidence for each of the crucial interpretive claims. First is Fëanor's problematic personality. The histories present him as uncannily talented, but also hot-tempered, proud, paranoid, and tragically misled by the lies of Morgoth. Now, hot-tempered and proud does seem a fair characterization, but Fingolfin, who's treated very sympathetically in the Silmarillion, is also proud, and while he exercises greater restraint, he definitely succumbs to his anger on more than one occasion. Some of Fëanor's talking points might mirror Morgoth's, but even the Silmarillion's narrator is forced to admit that Fëanor was one of the few who openly mistrusted Morgoth and refused to listen to him, even when he offered to ally with him against the other Valar. So whatever ideas Fëanor might have derived from Morgoth, we know he did so indirectly. And while Morgoth had malign intent, there is truth mixed in with his lies. The Valar do have foreknowledge of the coming of men, and they have kept that knowledge from the elves. They do seem pretty obsessed with Fëanor's Silmarils, and they eventually pressure him to give them up. Fingolfin is trying to end Finwë's support of Fëanor's radical ideas, and he does eventually become the de facto ruler in Tirion as Fëanor feared. You know what they say, it's not paranoia when they really are out to get you. And at the time, it seems Fëanor had some good reasons for believing what he believed and acting accordingly. So the desire, shared by Fëanor and many other elves, to leave Valinor and return to Middle-earth isn't as outlandish as it's sometimes presented. Even among the Valar, the decision to invite the elves to move to Amon was a controversial one. Tolkien himself comments on a few occasions that it was likely a mistake. It's also not clear why, once the elves have arrived, they're so strongly discouraged from trying to return. Yes, Middle-earth is perilous, and the elves of Aman are protected from Morgoth's corruption of the earth, but as the Finwëans demonstrate, there are also risks in keeping the elves penned up. Next, we have to consider the surprising behavior of the Teleri when the Noldor approach them for help. Our narrators present Olwe's refusal to join the Noldor in their flight as sensible, in contrast to Feanor's hysteria. But it is actually quite surprising that Olwe of all people would hold this position. The Teleri lingered longest on the shores of Middle-earth. Many of them actually remained behind, and those who did finally journey to Valinor remained on its eastern shore. You would expect that Olwe would sympathize with the desire to return, or maybe have some concerns about Morgoth returning in all his evil glory to the lands where his unprotected kin still live. But not only does he not share the Noldor's desire to leave, he outright refuses to even loan them his boats, and Feanor seems legitimately taken aback by this. He even goes to sit and think things over, which is highly uncharacteristic. The actual kinslaying itself is described with the horror appropriate to a massacre, but even the narrators admit that it wasn't exactly one-sided. The Noldor's attempt to steal the ships was unlawful, true, but it's the Teleri who first turned to violence by throwing the Noldor overboard. Although the Noldor were become fierce and desperate, and the Teleri had less strength and were armed for the most part but with slender bows, the Teleri drive the people of Feanor back 3 times, and it's only when the party of Fingolfin arrives and jumps in to defend their kin that they succeed in making it onto the ships. Olwe calls on the Maya Ase for, well, not defense because the battle's already over, so presumably it's just out of spite. The Valar, however, do not permit him to interfere, which is strange considering Ase's notorious rebellious streak. Instead, his soft-hearted and obedient wife Weenan raises a storm which sends many of the Noldor down to watery graves. Apparently the Valar excuse this, since Weenan's overpowered by her grief over the Telaran mariners who were, remember, so wickedly slain by the heartless Noldor. This brings us to the final assumption made by the Silmarillion's narrators, and the one least supported by the evidence, the assertion that the Valar opposed but did not actively interfere with the departure of Feanor. Even if we uncritically accept the events as related in the Silmarillion, this assertion could raise some eyebrows. As we've already seen, Feanor and the rest of the Noldor do have some decent reasons to mistrust or even fear the Valar, given their secrecy and their strange unwillingness to allow the elves to depart. Then there's the Doom of the Noldor, supposed to be delivered by no less than Mandos himself, which is basically a veiled threat to everyone except the House of Feanor, who we are told have already incurred the Valar's wrath and so shouldn't even bother trying to repent. While the Valar don't outright prevent anyone from leaving, they are apparently comfortable shutting out anyone who should try to return after they've delivered their ultimatum. To impose such a penalty certainly seems like it was intended to influence the decisions of the Noldor. Perhaps, instead of a threat, the Doom of the Noldor could be read as a warning, but if so, it's a very unhelpful one. For one thing, it makes a big deal of cautioning the Noldor against treachery and the fear of treachery, a statement all but guaranteed to inflame any existing mistrust between the different factions. Ironically, when Feanor and his partisans steal away on the ships and leave Fingolfin behind, it's because there's at least one saying of the Valar that they've apparently taken to heart. Then again, maybe it's not as ironic as it seems. Feanor's trip is sped by a wind that suddenly arises as if he called it. Feanor can't control the wind, of course, but Manwë can, and it almost seems like, having failed to manipulate or intimidate him, the Valar are trying to get rid of Feanor at this point. Come to think of it, wasn't it because of their unwillingness to defy the Valar that the Teleri refused to join with the Noldor? At first, they just attempted to dissuade the Noldor from leaving, which is in keeping with the Valar's stated policy of passive non-intervention, but they also seem prepared, mentally and physically, to actively resist the Noldor's departure, even to the point of armed violence. Why would they have had their slender bows on their ships, after all, if not intending to defend them? Fingolfin's party even assumes that the Teleri had sought to waylay the march of the Noldor at the bidding of the Valar. If I were of a conspiratorial mindset, I would say that the only way Olwe's people would dare to even consider such measures would be if they had approval from the Valar to do so. But why would the Valar endorse such a horror? They're more than capable of stopping Feanor themselves, after all. Actually, since Feanor's proven to be so regrettably ungovernable, you'd expect them to be happy to see him go. But of course the Noldor in general are very useful, crucial even, to maintaining the beauty and comfort of Valinor, so you wouldn't want to get rid of all of them. If you could devise some sort of situation where only the most pious and least violent Noldor would remain in Valinor, while also justifying using the rest of them as live bait to keep Morgoth busy, Well, that would obviously be the most convenient scenario. Tolkien himself observed that the Noldor's return was strategically very beneficial to Manwë. Given their ancient friendship with the Noldor, the Teleri would likely object to this arrangement unless something truly traumatizing were to destroy that friendship. Does this then mean that the Valar orchestrated the first kinslaying by giving secret instruction to Olwe in a remarkably successful attempt to rid themselves of an undesirably ungovernable element, break Eldarin's solidarity, and put an end to any further talk of departure by forever associating it with horror and death while also keeping Morgoth out of their hair? Am I suggesting that such a claim could be called Tolkienian? No. No, I am not. Somewhere in this round of the Great Game, I have crossed the line between reconstruction and deconstruction, which demonstrates a couple of things. The first of which is that the line does indeed exist. What's less clear is where precisely I crossed it. I feel pretty confident that Tolkien deliberately encouraged his readers to pay attention to the potential limitations of his narrator's perspectives, so I don't think he'd disapprove of the act of reinterpretation in itself. I've taken pains to question only the interpretation of the events recounted in this section and not the events themselves, so I'm not acting in subcreative bad faith. I also don't think Tolkien would object to me using a chance to more fully explore the possible motivations of his characters, even if that makes Feanor more sympathetic and Olwe less blameless than the text suggests. While I have challenged some specific moral judgments made in the narrative, I don't think I've totally inverted morality itself. Making Feanor more relatable isn't the same as making him wholly good. The Valar can still be argued to have good intentions underlying their occasional lapses in judgment. The Teleri still get a raw deal. Morgoth is still malicious and deceitful. So in this particular case, I think the point at which I entered un-Tolkienian territory is in suggesting a purely political or utilitarian motive for an event with a strong mythic element. Even though presented as a feigned history, the Silmarillion remains elf-centric. Apart from the literal events of the plot, most of the information it gives us concerns how the elves, especially the Noldor and the Sindar, make emotional and psychological sense of things. In that sense, the story as interpreted by our fallible narrators is the true one, regardless of how accurate we suppose it to be in its details, because it conveys the horror, guilt, and regret that will color the rest of the Noldor's experience in Arda. So while there may not be one single question that can determine fidelity to Tolkien, that doesn't mean the distinction is meaningless. Rather, it means that such evaluations must be holistic, and take into account the literal, moral, and the aesthetic meanings of the work. In that way, infidelity to Tolkien is a bit like obscenity. You know it when you see it. Leave a like to show solidarity with Feanor, and if you particularly enjoyed the egregious character assassination of His Majesty King Olwe, you might want to consider subscribing to the channel. Again, full credit or blame for this choice of topic rests with my Patreon supporters. If wielding that kind of power appeals to you, or you just want some bonus content, you can check out the link to my page in the description. Thank you for watching, and particular thanks to my patrons including Dorwin Gray, Allison Kreutzberg, Karen and Michael Donahue, John Love, Brendan Mooney, E. Rose B., Frankie 12-String, Louis Maskell, Tamara Saldana, Luke, Kevin Gilstad, Joel Bion, Rogue Hot Pocket, Elu Thickgoal, and Jared Carver. Until next time.